In small-town New Hampshire, a 62-year-old woman dismissed as financially irresponsible was about to challenge everything her community believed about second chances. What started as comforting a grieving neighbor took a shocking turn when they discovered devastating financial betrayal. Sarah Mitchell wasn't your typical career changer. For decades, she had survived bankruptcies and financial disasters, known for her resilience despite repeated setbacks. When she encountered Frank Thompson's tears over losing his life savings to a predatory scheme, she had no idea she was walking into her own transformation. Sarah made a declaration that would lead to the most unlikely professional journey in town history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell stood at Frank Thompson's kitchen window, watching October leaves spiral down from the ancient maple in his backyard. The tree had weathered 70 New Hampshire winters, its roots deep enough to survive whatever storms came its way. Sarah envied its resilience. At 62, she felt more like the brittle leaves, fragile, disconnected, one strong wind away from complete collapse. "I keep thinking Margaret would know what to do," Frank said behind her, his voice cracking. "Like old leather. 43 years she handled our money. Never missed a payment, never made a bad decision. And here I am, 6 months after losing her, and I've gone and lost everything else too." Sarah turned from the window to find Frank slumped at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers that might as well have been written in Sanskrit for all the sense they made to either of them. Bank statements, investment summaries, and legal documents formed a paper mountain of financial devastation. The numbers told a story Sarah knew too well, the story of dreams deferred, security shattered, and trust betrayed. "Tell me again what happened," she said gently, settling into the chair across from him. She'd heard the story twice already this week, but Frank needed to tell it, needed someone to witness his pain. Frank's weathered hands shook as he reached for a manila folder. This financial advisor, Marcus Henley, he came to the funeral. Real polished fellow, expensive suit, nice car. Said he specialized in helping widows and widowers. Made it sound like he was doing me a favor, taking me on as a client. Sarah's stomach clenched. She'd seen Marcus around town, young, confident, the kind of man who wore success like cologne. The kind of man who would never give someone like her a second glance. He said Margaret's life insurance money was just sitting there, losing value to inflation. Said he could get me 12% returns, guaranteed. Conservative investments, he called them, municipal bonds and blue-chip stocks. Frank's laugh was bitter. Turns out they were some kind of high-risk derivatives I'd never heard of. When the market crashed last month, everything went with it. $60,000. Gone. $60,000. Sarah's entire net worth wouldn't cover half that amount. Her own financial disasters had been smaller in scale but no less devastating. Credit cards maxed out helping her kids through college, a second mortgage taken out to cover her ex-husband's business debts, retirement accounts cashed out during her divorces. Each crisis had chipped away at her dignity until she'd become the family cautionary tale. The woman who couldn't be trusted with a grocery budget, let alone investment decisions. "I'm sorry, Frank. I'm so sorry." The words felt inadequate, like offering a Band-Aid for a severed artery. Frank looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much loss. "The worst part? I knew better. Margaret always said if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. But I was scared, Sarah. Scared of being alone with all those decisions. Scared of ending up eating cat food in some nursing home." He gestured around the modest kitchen that had been his sanctuary for 4 decades. "Now I might lose the house anyway." Sarah reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. His skin was paper thin, mapped with liver spots and old scars from his years working at the lumber mill. Good hands, honest hands, hands that deserved better than being used to sign away a lifetime of careful savings. We'll figure something out, she said, though she had no idea what. Sarah Mitchell, offering financial advice. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. After leaving Frank's house, Sarah drove to Millie's Diner on Main Street, desperate for coffee and the illusion of normalcy. The October afternoon was crisp with the promise of winter, and the maple trees that lined the street blazed orange and red against the cloudy sky. But even nature's beauty couldn't mask the signs of economic distress that had crept into Grayson. Falls like a slow-moving plague. 3 storefronts on Main Street stood empty, their windows papered with for lease signs. The hardware store that had been run by the same family for 60 years was having a going-out-of-business sale. Even Millie's seemed subdued, its usual afternoon crowd reduced to a handful of regulars nursing coffee and worried conversations. Sarah slid into a corner booth and ordered coffee. Black. She couldn't afford the luxury of cream anymore. At the next table, 2 women in their 50s spoke in hushed tones about foreclosure notices and unemployment benefits. Behind them, an elderly man studied what looked like a Social Security statement, his brow furrowed with concern. "Lost our whole retirement account," one of the women was saying. "Tom's been with the paper mill for 32 years, and now they're talking layoffs. I don't know what we're going to do." "At least you've got time to figure it out," her companion replied. "My sister's 67. Her financial advisor moved her money into some high-risk fund right before everything collapsed. She's talking about going back to work as a cashier." Sarah stared into her coffee, seeing her own reflection distorted in the dark surface. How many people in this town were facing the same crisis? How many had trusted the wrong person, made the wrong choice, or simply been unlucky enough to need their money at exactly the wrong time? Her phone buzzed against the table. Bobby's name appeared on the caller ID, and Sarah's chest tightened. Her son only called when he needed something or when he had something to say about her financial management, and neither conversation ever went well. "Hi, sweetheart," she answered, injecting false cheer into her voice. "Mom, I got your message about the electric bill." Bobby's tone carried the exasperated patience of a parent addressing a particularly difficult child. "You can't keep calling me every time you have a cash flow problem." Cash flow problem. As if her inability to pay basic utilities was simply a matter of poor timing rather than the reality of living on Social Security and part-time retail wages. "I know, Bobby. I just thought—" "You thought what? That I'd bail you out again?" "Mom, I've got a mortgage, private school tuition for Emma, and my own retirement to think about. I can't keep being your personal ATM." Sarah's face burned with shame. Around her, the diner conversations continued, a soundtrack of financial anxiety that matched the melody playing in her own head. "I understand. I shouldn't have asked." "It's not about the money, Mom." "Well, it is, but—" Bobby sighed heavily. "Look, you're 62 years old. At some point, you have to figure out how to manage your finances like an adult. Maybe if you hadn't declared bankruptcy twice, or if you'd saved something during your working years instead of spending everything on raising you and your sister," Sarah interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "On keeping a roof over your heads and food on the table when your fathers decided they had better things to do with their money." The silence stretched between them, filled with decades of resentment and misunderstanding. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering Bobby at 8 years old, standing in the kitchen while she explained why they couldn't afford the school field trip. The way his small face had crumpled with disappointment. The way he'd learned, too young, to stop asking for things. "I'm sorry," Bobby said finally. "That wasn't fair. But Mom, you have to see this from my perspective. Every few months, there's another crisis, another emergency, another reason why you can't make ends meet. I love you, but I can't keep enabling this pattern." Enabling, as if her financial struggles were some kind of addiction she was choosing to indulge in, rather than the accumulated weight of 40 years of bad luck, worse choices, and a system that seemed designed to punish people for being human. "You're right," Sarah said quietly. "I need to figure this out myself." After Bobby hung up, Sarah sat in the diner booth for another hour, listening to the conversations around her and staring at her reflection in the window. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across Main Street. Inside, she felt something shifting, a strange combination of desperation and determination that she hadn't experienced in years. She thought about Frank, trusting and betrayed, about the women at the next table, facing an uncertain future, about Bobby, successful and ashamed of where he came from, about herself, 62 years old and still being lectured about financial responsibility by the son she'd raised single-handedly while working 3 jobs. What if there was another way? The thought came unbidden, ridiculous, and impossible. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who'd filed for bankruptcy twice, becoming a financial advisor. The woman who couldn't manage her own money helping others manage theirs. It was laughable, absurd. But as she sat there, watching the sun set over a town, full of people who'd been failed by the very system that was supposed to protect them, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. By the time she reached Linda Patterson's house, Sarah's hands were shaking with nervous energy. Linda answered the door in her robe and slippers, her gray hair still showing the indent of her afternoon nap. "Sarah, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Can I come in? I need to tell you something, and you're going to think I've lost my mind." Linda ushered her into the living room, where the television was tuned to the evening news. Images of Wall Street, unemployment lines, and foreclosure signs filled the screen while anchors discussed the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. "Linda?" Sarah said, settling onto the familiar couch where she'd cried through 3 divorces and countless other disasters. "I'm going to become a financial advisor." Linda muted the television and turned to study her best friend's face. After 30 years of friendship, she'd learned to recognize the difference between Sarah's passing whims and her serious declarations. This felt serious. "Honey, maybe we should call Jessica, or Bobby. I think you might be having some kind of breakdown." "I'm not having a breakdown. I'm having a breakthrough." Sarah leaned forward, her words coming faster now. "Think about it, Linda. Who better to help people avoid financial mistakes than someone who's made them all? Who better to understand what it's like to lose everything than someone who's been there?" Linda's expression shifted from concern to something that might have been understanding. "Sarah, you don't even have a college degree. Don't you need licenses and certifications and all kinds of things to give financial advice?" "Then I'll get them. I'll study. I'll take tests. I'll do whatever it takes." Sarah's voice was stronger now, filled with a conviction that surprised them both. "Linda, I've spent 40 years being the cautionary tale, the woman everyone points to as an example of what not to do. But maybe that's exactly what qualifies me to help people do better." Linda was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face in the lamplight. Finally, she spoke. "You know, when I was working in the cardiac unit, some of our best nurses were the ones who'd had heart attacks themselves. They understood what the patients were going through in a way the rest of us couldn't." Exactly. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who'd stood by her through every disaster, every mistake, every moment when she'd wanted to give up. "I can't promise I'll succeed. God knows my track record doesn't exactly inspire confidence. But I can't keep living like this, Linda. I can't keep being the family failure, the woman who can't be trusted with money. I have to try something different." Linda reached over and took Sarah's hand. "Then I guess we better figure out how to make you a financial advisor." As they sat together in the warm glow of the living room, surrounded by the detritus of middle-class life, family photos, worn furniture, the comfortable chaos of a life fully lived, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not hope, exactly, but something close to it. The possibility that the worst chapter of her life might not be the final one. Outside, October wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at shadows. But inside, two women, in their 60s, began planning the most unlikely career change in Grayson Falls history. Sarah's hand trembled as she stared at the computer screen in the Grayson Falls Public Library, the cursor blinking mockingly in the search bar. 3 days had passed since her declaration to Linda, and the initial surge of determination was giving way to the cold reality of what she'd committed to doing. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across her face as she typed, "How to become financial advisor," into Google. The results overwhelmed her immediately. Series 65 exam, FINRA registration, sponsoring broker-dealer, investment advisor representatives. The terminology swam before her eyes like a foreign language she'd never learned to speak. Sarah had barely graduated high school, spending most of her adult life working jobs that required quick thinking and people skills rather than formal education. Now, at 62, she was trying to navigate a professional world that seemed designed to exclude people like her. "Having trouble with the computer, Mrs. Mitchell?" Sarah looked up to find Jake Williams standing beside her table, his banker's tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. At 28, Jake had the kind of earnest face that made people trust him with their mortgage applications and car loans. Sarah had seen him around town, but had never spoken to him directly. Successful young professionals didn't typically socialize with twice-bankrupt retail workers. "I'm trying to research something," Sarah said, minimizing the browser window. Reflexively. The last thing she needed was for word to get around town that crazy Sarah Mitchell was researching financial careers. Jake glanced at the screen, then at Sarah with curiosity rather than judgment. "Financial advisor licensing? That's actually pretty interesting. Mind if I sit down?" Sarah hesitated, then gestured to the empty chair. Jake settled beside her, his presence somehow making the library feel less intimidating. "I work at First National," he said. "I see a lot of people coming in who've been burned by bad financial advice, especially lately, with everything that's happening in the markets." He studied her face. "Are you thinking about career change?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah could lie, make up some story about researching investments for herself, but something in Jake's expression, genuine interest without condescension, made her take a risk. "People have been getting hurt," she said quietly. "My neighbor lost his wife's life insurance money to some smooth-talking advisor who promised guaranteed returns. I keep thinking there has to be a better way to help people." Jake nodded slowly. "There is. But it's not easy to break into the industry, especially without connections or a finance background." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Can I ask what your background is?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Waitressing, retail, a little bookkeeping. Oh, and 2 bankruptcies and 3 failed marriages. Not exactly the resume most people look for in a financial advisor." She expected Jake to make an excuse and leave. Instead, he leaned forward with increased interest. "You know what's interesting about that? Most financial advisors I know come from privileged backgrounds. They've never had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries. They don't understand what it's like to make financial decisions out of desperation." He gestured toward the computer screen. "Maybe that's exactly the perspective people need." For the next hour, Jake helped Sarah navigate the licensing requirements. The Series 65 exam covered investment strategies, ethics, and regulatory issues. She'd need to find a registered investment advisory firm willing to sponsor her, which would allow her to take the exam and eventually register as an investment advisor representative. "The studying is the easy part," Jake explained, bookmarking several online prep courses. "The hard part is finding a firm willing to take a chance on someone without traditional credentials." Sarah's heart sank. "So basically, I need someone To believe in me before I can prove I'm worth believing in. Welcome to the financial services industry, Jake said with a wry smile. But hey, if you're serious about this, I might be able to help. I know some people in town who might be willing to give you a shot. 3 days later, Sarah found herself standing outside Whitman Financial Services, checking her reflection in the glass door. She'd borrowed Linda's best blazer and spent her last $20 on pantyhose and lipstick, trying to look like someone who belonged in a professional office. Her palms were sweating as she pushed open the door. Eleanor Whitman's reception area was designed to intimidate: marble floors, leather furniture, and framed diplomas covering one wall like trophies. Eleanor herself emerged from an inner office, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and her suit probably worth more than Sarah made in 2 months. "Ms. Mitchell?" Eleanor's voice carried the kind of polished authority that came from years of dealing with wealthy clients. "I understand you're interested in joining our team?" Sarah's carefully rehearsed speech evaporated under Eleanor's scrutiny. "I'm looking for sponsorship to take the Series 65 exam. I know my background isn't traditional, but—" "What exactly is your background?" Eleanor interrupted, settling behind her desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Sarah forced herself to meet Eleanor's gaze. "I've worked in customer service for 20 years. I understand people, and I understand what it's like to struggle financially. I think that could be valuable in helping clients who—" Eleanor's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Ms. Mitchell, financial planning is a sophisticated profession requiring extensive knowledge of markets, tax law, and investment strategies. Our clients trust us with millions of dollars in assets. They expect expertise, not sympathy. But surely there's value in understanding—" "What there's value in," Eleanor said, standing to signal the meeting's end, "is professional competence. This isn't playing dress-up, Ms. Mitchell. This is serious business for serious professionals." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Playing dress-up, as if her desire to help people was some kind of elaborate game. She left Eleanor's office with her cheeks burning and her confidence shattered. The second firm, Henderson and Associates, was more polite but equally dismissive. The third, Pinnacle Wealth Management, didn't even grant her a meeting. The receptionist took one look at Sarah's borrowed blazer and suggested she try the temp agency down the street. By Thursday afternoon, Sarah was ready to abandon the entire plan. She sat in her car outside the library, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Maybe Bobby was right. Maybe she was too old, too damaged, too fundamentally flawed to reinvent herself. Her phone rang. Jake's name appeared on the screen. "Sarah? I heard things didn't go well with the big firms in town." Sarah closed her eyes. Word travels fast. "Small town. But listen, I've been talking to Bill Davidson. He's a retired financial advisor who still does some consulting work. He's old school, pretty gruff, but he believes in giving people chances. Would you be interested in meeting with him?" Sarah stared out at the October sky, where clouds were gathering for another New England storm. Part of her wanted to say no, to accept defeat, and return to the safe mediocrity of retail work. But then she thought about Frank Thompson, alone in his kitchen with his pile of worthless investment statements. "Yes," she said, "I'm interested." "Great. He can see you tomorrow at 2. Fair warning, he's going to test you. Hard. But if he decides to sponsor you, his name still carries weight in this industry." After Jake hung up, Sarah sat in her car for another 10 minutes, watching people hurry past on the sidewalk. Tomorrow would bring another test, another chance to prove herself or face rejection. But tonight, she had studying to do. The cursor blinked on her computer screen again, but this time Sarah knew exactly what to type. Sarah's kitchen table had become a war zone of highlighters, sticky notes, and practice exams that seemed to multiply overnight like financial planning hydras. At 5:47 a.m., she sat hunched over her third cup of coffee, trying to make sense of the difference between systematic and unsystematic risk, while her alarm clock ticked toward her 7 a.m. shift at Walmart. The Series 65 study guide lay open to chapters 12. Portfolio Theory and Modern Portfolio Theory. The words swam before her tired eyes like tadpoles in a murky pond. Beta coefficients, efficient frontiers, capital asset pricing models. Each concept felt like trying to grab smoke with her bare hands. "Okay, Sarah," she muttered to herself, the way she'd learned to do during her loneliest moments. An investment with a beta of 1-2 means. She closed her eyes, trying to recall yesterday's lesson. It's 20% more volatile than the market. She flipped to a practice question. If an investment has a beta of 0.8 and the market return is 10%, what would be the expected return using PAPM, assuming a risk-free rate of 3%? Sarah stared at the numbers until they blurred. Mathematics had never been her strength. She'd learned to balance checkbooks and calculate tips, but this felt like trying to perform brain surgery with a butter knife. Her phone buzzed. A text from her supervisor. "Need someone to cover 2:10 shift today. Extra hours available." Extra hours meant extra money, and extra money meant she could afford to keep her electricity on for another month. But extra hours also meant less time to study, and she was already falling behind the schedule she'd optimistically created 3 weeks ago. Sarah looked at the practice exam she'd attempted the night before. Score, 42%. Passing was 72%. The familiar taste of failure crept up her throat like bile. This was what always happened. She'd get excited about something, dive in head first, then reality would crash down like a sledgehammer. The mortgage she couldn't refinance, the business loan that went bad when her second husband's restaurant failed, the credit cards she'd maxed out trying to keep her family afloat. Maybe Bobby was right. Maybe she was delusional to think she could master something this complex at her age. Her hands started to shake. Not the gentle tremor of too much caffeine, but the deep, bone-rattling anxiety that had plagued her since her first bankruptcy. The kitchen walls seemed to close in as her breathing became shallow and rapid. Sarah pushed back from the table so hard her chair scraped against the linoleum. The study materials scattered across the floor like accusations. Portfolio theory, risk management, client suitability, all concepts that required the kind of analytical thinking that had never come naturally to her. She was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by scattered papers, when Jessica arrived at 6:30 p.m. "Mom?" Jessica's voice carried the careful tone she used when she suspected Sarah was having an episode. "What's going on here?" Sarah looked up at her daughter, 32 years old, sensibly dressed in her teacher clothes, carrying the weight of her own financial struggles but managing them with the caution Sarah had never possessed. "I'm studying," Sarah said, though the evidence suggested otherwise. Jessica surveyed the chaos. Study guides torn at the corners from frustrated handling. Practice exams marked with increasingly illegible handwriting. A coffee cup overturned and spreading a brown stain across what looked like an important chapter on ethics. "Mom? This isn't studying. This is..." Jessica paused, choosing her words carefully. "This is what you do when you're having one of your manic episodes. Remember when you decided to start that catering business? Or when you were going to become a real estate agent?" The comparison stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. Sarah had always been prone to grand gestures, dramatic reinventions that collapsed under the weight of reality. But this felt different. It had to be different. "This isn't like those other times," Sarah said, pulling herself up from the floor. "Jessica, I've been studying every day for 3 weeks. I'm learning things I never thought I could understand." "You're scoring 42% on practice exams," Jessica said, picking up the most recent test. "Mom, I love you, but you can't." Just will yourself into understanding complex financial concepts. This requires years of education, real credentials. I don't have years, Sarah interrupted. I'm 62 years old. If I don't do this now, I'll spend the rest of my life being the family cautionary tale. Jessica's expression softened. You're not a cautionary tale. You're my mother. You raised me and Bobby practically single-handed while working 3 jobs. You don't have anything to prove to anyone. But that was exactly the problem, Sarah realized. She had everything to prove. To Bobby, who was embarrassed by her failures. To the community that saw her as financially hopeless. To herself, most of all. That evening, Linda arrived with takeout Chinese food and an agenda. Jess called me, Linda said without preamble, unpacking containers of lo mein and sweet and sour chicken. Said you were having a breakdown over your studying. I'm not having a breakdown. I'm having a learning curve. Linda settled across from Sarah at the cleared kitchen table. Okay, so let's learn. Show me what you're working on. For the next 2 hours, Linda proved to be an unexpectedly effective study partner. Her nursing background had taught her to break complex medical concepts into digestible pieces, and she applied the same methodology to portfolio theory. Think of diversification like this, Linda said, drawing diagrams on napkins. Remember when you were waitressing at 3 different restaurants? If one place had a slow night, you still had income from the other 2. That's diversification, not putting all your eggs in one basket. Suddenly, the concept clicked. Sarah's eyes widened as connections began forming in her mind. And systematic risk, Linda continued. That's like when the whole economy goes bad. Doesn't matter how many restaurants you work at, if people stop eating out, you're screwed across the board. But unsystematic risk, Sarah said, the light bulb flickering to life. That's when one specific restaurant has problems. Bad management, health code violations, whatever. You can protect yourself from that by diversifying. Linda grinned. Now you're getting it. They worked until midnight, translating academic concepts into real-world analogies that made sense to someone who'd lived paycheck to paycheck for decades. Beta became volatility, how much your income swung up and down compared to everyone else's. The efficient frontier became the sweet spot between risk and reward that every working person instinctively understood. When Linda finally left, Sarah sat alone at her kitchen table, looking at the same practice exam that had defeated her that morning. This time, she scored 58%. Not passing yet, but progress. Real, measurable progress. Outside, October wind rattled her windows, but inside, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The quiet satisfaction of learning something genuinely difficult. The knowledge that her brain, despite decades of self-doubt, was still capable of growth. She had 6 weeks until her meeting with Bill Davidson. 6 weeks to prove that life experience could be transformed into professional competence. 6 weeks to turn her failures into her greatest qualification. Sarah opened her study guide to Chapter 13, Investment Company Securities. Tomorrow would bring new concepts, new challenges, new opportunities to fail or succeed. But tonight, for the first time in months, she felt capable of either. The testing center in Manchester felt like a sterile cathedral dedicated to the god of professional certification. Sarah arrived 45 minutes early, her hands trembling despite 3 months of preparation. She clutched her confirmation letter and 2 forms of identification like talismans against failure, watching younger candidates stride confidently through the doors with their expensive briefcases and MBA swagger. At 62, Sarah was easily the oldest person in the waiting room. A few 20-somethings in sharp suits glanced at her with barely concealed curiosity, probably wondering if she was someone's grandmother who'd gotten lost on the way to the MV. Sarah smoothed her borrowed blazer, the same one she'd worn to those disastrous interviews months ago, and tried to project a confidence she didn't feel. Sarah Mitchell? The proctor's voice cut through her spiraling anxiety. Sarah followed the young woman into a sterile room lined with computer terminals. The Series 65 exam would be 130 questions covering everything from investment strategies to regulatory requirements. She had 3 hours to prove that a twice-bankrupt retail worker could master the complexities of financial planning. The first section covered investment vehicles, and Sarah felt her confidence build as she recognized concepts that had seemed impossible just months ago. Municipal bonds, real estate investment trusts, variable annuities, terms that Linda had helped her understand using analogies from their own lives. She moved through these questions steadily, drawing on her hard-earned knowledge. But when she reached the calculation section, her old mathematics anxiety returned with a vengeance. Present value formulas, standard deviation calculations, correlation coefficients, numbers that seemed to mock her high school education and blue-collar background. Sarah closed her eyes and heard Bill Davidson's gruff voice from their practice sessions. "Don't overthink it, Mitchell. You've been making risk assessments your whole life. When you chose between paying rent and fixing your car, that was portfolio management. When you decided which job to take based on stability versus pay, that was risk analysis." She opened her eyes and approached the next question with renewed focus. A client has $100,000 to invest and wants a 7% return with moderate risk. Which allocation would be most appropriate? Sarah thought about Frank Thompson, alone in his kitchen with his pile of worthless investment statements. What would he need? Safety first, but enough growth to keep up with inflation. She selected the balanced portfolio option and moved on. The ethics section was where Sarah truly found her footing. Questions about fiduciary duty, conflicts of interest, and client suitability felt like moral issues rather than technical problems. She thought about Marcus Henley, the smooth-talking advisor who'd convinced Frank to invest in unsuitable high-risk derivatives. Sarah knew exactly how to spot the warning signs because she'd been on the receiving end of similar sales pitches. When a question asked about the appropriate response to a client requesting an investment beyond their risk tolerance, Sarah didn't hesitate. Educate the client about the risks and refuse to make unsuitable recommendations. It was common sense wrapped in regulatory language. 3 hours later, Sarah submitted her exam and walked out into the October afternoon with shaking legs and a pounding heart. The results would be available immediately, but she couldn't bring herself to check them in the crowded testing center. Instead, she drove to the parking lot of a nearby diner and sat in her car, staring at the confirmation email on her phone. Her finger hovered over the link. Pass or fail, her life would change in the next 30 seconds. If she failed, she could retake the exam in 30 days, but the blow to her fragile confidence might be insurmountable. If she passed, Sarah clicked the link. Pass, score, 78%. She stared at the screen until the letters blurred through her tears. Sarah Mitchell, high school graduate, twice bankrupt retail worker, had passed a professional examination that many college-educated candidates failed. She'd actually done it. Her phone rang almost immediately. Bill Davidson's name appeared on the screen. "Well?" His voice was characteristically gruff, but she could hear something underneath. Anticipation, maybe even hope. "I passed," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What was that?" "Speak up, Mitchell." "I passed," Sarah shouted, not caring who heard her in the parking lot. "I actually passed." Bill's laugh was rusty but genuine. "Figured you might. Score?" 78%. Not bad for someone who learned portfolio theory at a kitchen table. Come see me Monday. We've got paperwork to file and a practice to build. After Bill hung up, Sarah sat in her car for another 20 minutes, letting the reality sink in. She was now legally qualified to give investment advice. The irony was almost overwhelming. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who couldn't manage her own finances, was now licensed to help others manage theirs. Her phone buzzed with a text from Linda. How did it go? Instead of texting back, Sarah called her best friend. "Linda, I passed." The scream on the other end of the line was so loud Sarah had to hold the phone away from her ear. "I knew it! I knew you could do it! Sarah, I'm so proud of you I could burst! We're celebrating tonight. My treat." That evening, as Sarah and Linda shared a bottle of cheap champagne at the local Applebee's, her phone rang again. Bobby's name on the screen made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "Hi, sweetheart," she answered, bracing for skepticism. "Mom, Linda called Jessica. And Jessica called me. Is it true? Did you really pass that exam?" Sarah could hear something in her son's voice that she hadn't heard in years. Surprise, maybe even a hint of respect. "I did. I'm officially licensed to work as an investment advisor representative." The silence on the other end stretched so long Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. "Mom, Bobby's voice cracked slightly. "I owe you an apology. When you first told me about this plan, I thought you were having another one of your episodes. I didn't think you could actually pull it off." "Neither did I," Sarah admitted. "But I had to try. I couldn't keep living with everyone thinking I was just a walking financial disaster." "You were never that," Bobby said quietly. "You were a single mother doing the best you could with what you had. I'm sorry it took me this long to see the difference." After Bobby hung up, Sarah stared out the restaurant window at the November darkness. In 3 months, she'd gone from desperate and defeated to licensed and hopeful. But she knew the real test was just beginning. Passing an exam was one thing. Building a practice, earning clients' trust, and proving she could actually help people, that would be the true measure of whether this transformation was real or just another of her elaborate self-deceptions. But tonight, sitting across from Linda with champagne bubbles tickling her nose and her son's grudging respect warming her heart, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found her calling at last. The woman who'd lost everything was finally ready to help. Others avoid the same fate. Sarah stood in the doorway of what would become her office, inhaling the scent of fresh paint and possibility. The space was hardly impressive, a modest room in a shared business complex on the outskirts of downtown Grayson Falls, with beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and a window that overlooked the parking lot of an auto parts store. But it was hers. Bill Davidson had helped her negotiate the lease and navigate the maze of regulatory requirements for establishing an investment advisory practice. Her business cards, printed at Kinko's on heavyweight stock she couldn't really afford, read Sarah Mitchell, investment advisor representative in simple black lettering. No fancy logos or marketing slogans, just her name and a promise to help. The technology learning curve proved steeper than the Series 65 exam. Sarah sat hunched over her secondhand computer, wrestling with portfolio management software that seemed designed by people who'd never struggled with anything more complex than choosing between premium and regular gas. "Come on," she muttered, clicking through menu after menu trying to generate a simple risk assessment questionnaire. The software wanted her to input client data fields she'd never heard of. Liquid net worth, investment time horizon, risk capacity, versus risk tolerance. Each term sent her scrambling back to her study materials or calling Bill for clarification. Her first prospective clients, the Andersons, arrived precisely at 2 p.m. for their scheduled consultation. Tom Anderson was a middle manager at the paper mill, his wife Susan a part-time bookkeeper at the local veterinary clinic. They looked nervous, clutching a manila folder of financial documents like a life preserver. "Mrs. Mitchell," Tom began. Carefully, "We've been hearing about your background, the financial difficulties you've had in the past." Sarah's stomach clenched. She'd known this moment would come, the moment when her history of bankruptcy and financial disaster would collide with her new professional identity. "That's true," she said evenly. "I filed for bankruptcy twice, and I made some significant financial mistakes over the years." Susan Anderson shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Then why should we trust you with our retirement savings?" It was a fair question. Sarah had rehearsed her answer dozens of times, but sitting across from real people with real concerns, the words felt flimsy and inadequate. "Because I understand what it feels like to lose everything," Sarah replied. "I know what it's like to lie awake at night wondering how you're going to pay the bills, or to watch your credit score plummet, or to feel ashamed every time someone mentions money. Most financial advisors have never experienced financial failure. I have, and I've learned from it." Tom and Susan exchanged glances. After 20 minutes of polite questions about their goals and risk tolerance, they thanked her for her time and left. Sarah never heard from them again. Frank Thompson, however, proved to be exactly the client she'd hoped to serve. He arrived at her office the following Tuesday, shuffling through her door with the hesitant gait of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what you said, about understanding what it's like to lose money." Frank settled into the chair across from her desk, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "I keep thinking maybe that's what I need. Someone who won't just throw around fancy words I don't understand." Sarah opened a fresh manila folder. "Tell me about your situation now, Frank. What do you have left?" Frank's story emerged slowly, like water seeping through damaged earth. After Marcus Henley's scheme collapsed, Frank was left with $12,000 in savings, his Social Security benefits, and the equity in his house. His monthly expenses, utilities, groceries, Medicare supplements, prescription medications, consumed nearly all of his fixed income. "I don't need to get rich," Frank said quietly. "I just need to know I won't end up homeless." Sarah studied his numbers, thinking about risk tolerance and asset allocation. But more than that, she thought about dignity, Frank's need to maintain his independence and self-respect in the face of financial devastation. "Frank, I think we need to focus on preservation first, growth second. You can't afford to lose any more money, but you also can't afford to have inflation eat away at what you have left." She recommended a conservative approach, 6 months of expenses in a high-yield savings account, the remainder split between conservative bond funds and dividend-paying stocks. Nothing flashy, nothing that promised unrealistic returns. Just steady, reliable investments that would help Frank maintain his purchasing power while he slept soundly at night. Frank listened carefully, asking questions that showed he understood the trade-offs they were making. When Sarah finished her presentation, he nodded slowly. "This makes sense to me, Sarah. It's not exciting, but exciting is what got me into trouble the first time." As Frank signed the paperwork to become her first official client, Sarah felt a surge of something she'd never experienced in any of her previous jobs, professional satisfaction mixed with genuine purpose. But her small victory was short-lived. 2 days later, she learned that Eleanor Whitman had contacted the Jameson family, prospective clients Sarah had been courting for weeks. The Jamesons owned a successful landscaping business and had accumulated substantial assets they needed help managing for retirement. "Mrs. Jameson called to cancel your appointment," Sarah's answering service informed her. She said they'd decided to go with a more established advisor. Sarah's hands shook as she hung up the phone. She didn't need to guess which established advisor had stolen her potential clients. Eleanor Whitman's reach in the local financial community was extensive, and her resources for client acquisition far exceeded Sarah's bootstrapped operation. Jake Williams called that afternoon with information that confirmed her suspicions. "I probably shouldn't tell you this," Jake said, his voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper. "But Eleanor's been making calls around town, telling people that you're unqualified, that your past bankruptcies make you unsuitable to handle other people's money." Sarah felt the familiar burn of humiliation in her chest. Is it working? With some people, yeah, but not everyone's buying it. There are folks in this town who know what it's like to struggle financially. They might actually prefer an advisor who understands their situation. That evening, Sarah sat in her small office after hours, reviewing Frank's portfolio allocation. One more time. Her first client, a man who'd been betrayed by a slick professional with impressive credentials, had chosen to trust her precisely because of her imperfect past. Sarah opened her computer and began drafting a simple newsletter for potential clients. No jargon, no promises of unrealistic returns. Just practical advice about budgeting, saving, and avoiding common financial mistakes. At the top, she wrote, "Financial recovery, learning from our mistakes." If Eleanor Whitman wanted to use Sarah's past against her, Sarah would embrace it. Her failures wouldn't be something to hide. They'd be her greatest qualification for helping others avoid the same pitfalls. Outside her window, November darkness had settled over Grayson Falls. But inside her modest office, Sarah Mitchell, licensed investment advisor and financial disaster survivor, was finally ready to build something lasting from the wreckage of her past. Sarah stared at the flyer in her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. Financial Recovery Workshop, Surviving Bankruptcy and Starting Over, was printed in bold letters across the top, followed by Presented by Sarah Mitchell, Investment Advisor Representative. Below that, in smaller text, Learn from someone who's been there. The Grayson Falls Community Center had agreed to let her use their meeting room for free, partly out of curiosity and partly because the director, Martha Stevens, had filed for bankruptcy herself 3 years earlier. Word of Sarah's unconventional background had spread through town like ripples in a pond. Some people scandalized, others intrigued. "You sure about this approach?" Bill Davidson asked, reviewing her presentation materials in his gruff, protective way. At 72, he'd seen plenty of financial advisors come and go, but none quite like Sarah. Most advisors try to project success, not advertise their failures. Sarah arranged her handouts, simple, one-page guides she'd created on topics like warning signs of financial scams and building an emergency fund on minimum wage. No complicated charts or academic theories, just practical advice written in language real people could understand. "Bill, I've tried projecting success. I've borrowed blazers and practiced impressive-sounding jargon. It doesn't work because it's not authentic." Sarah looked up at her mentor. The people who need help most aren't impressed by marble offices and fancy degrees. They're scared of them. The evening of her first workshop, 17 people showed up. Sarah had hoped for 10. Martha Stevens sat in the back offering moral support. Frank Thompson claimed a front-row seat, having appointed himself Sarah's unofficial cheerleader. But most attendees were strangers, working-class folks who looked as nervous about being there as Sarah felt about presenting. Sarah began by doing something she'd never seen another financial professional do. She told the truth about her failures. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a licensed investment advisor who has filed for bankruptcy twice," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I've made every financial mistake you can imagine, and probably a few you haven't thought of yet." A woman in the third row, maybe 45, wearing a waitress uniform from the local diner, leaned forward with sudden interest. "I'm here tonight because I believe the best teachers are often the ones who've learned the hard way," Sarah continued. "I can't promise to make you rich, but I can teach you how to avoid the mistakes that made me poor." For the next hour, Sarah shared her story with unflinching honesty. The credit cards she'd maxed out trying to save her second husband's failing restaurant. The home equity loan that disappeared into her third husband's gambling addiction. The way financial stress had infected every relationship, every decision, every moment of peace she'd tried to claim. But more importantly, she talked about recovery. How she'd rebuilt her credit one payment at a time. How she'd learned to distinguish between needs and wants. How she'd developed the discipline to live below her means, even when those means were embarrassingly modest. "The thing about hitting financial rock bottom," Sarah said, looking directly at the waitress in the third row, "is that it teaches you what's actually necessary to survive. Most people have no idea how little they could live on if they had to. I do, because I've done it." During the question period, hands shot up around the room. "How do you rebuild credit after bankruptcy?" asked a man in coveralls who looked like he worked construction. "What's the safest place to save money when you only have $50 a month?" asked a young mother bouncing a toddler on her lap. "How do you know if a financial advisor is trying to scam you?" asked an elderly woman who reminded Sarah of Frank. Sarah answered each question with specific, practical advice. No condescension, no judgment, just honest guidance from someone who'd navigated these exact challenges. After the workshop ended, 3 people approached her about individual consultations. The waitress, whose name was Carol Brennan, had been struggling since her divorce and needed help organizing her finances. The construction worker, Mike Santos, wanted advice on saving for his daughter's college education. The elderly woman, Ruth Palmer, had been burned by an advisor who'd sold her unsuitable annuities and needed help untangling the mess. Over the following weeks, Sarah's phone began ringing with inquiries from unexpected sources. A single mother, referred by Carol, a factory worker who'd heard about her approach from Mike, people who'd never considered hiring a financial advisor because they assumed such services were only for the wealthy. But Sarah's success didn't go unnoticed by the established financial community. Eleanor Whitman filed a complaint with the state securities department, alleging that Sarah's marketing approach was unprofessional and potentially misleading to clients. The investigation was brief but thorough. A state examiner reviewed Sarah's materials, interviewed several clients, and concluded that her approach, while unconventional, was both honest and compliant with all regulatory requirements. "If anything," the examiner told Sarah during their final meeting, "your transparency about past financial difficulties demonstrates exactly the kind of fiduciary honesty the industry needs more of." The complaint's dismissal was reported in the local newspaper, along with a feature story about Sarah's second-chance career. The headline read, "Local Woman Turns Financial Disasters into Advisory Success." The article quoted Frank Thompson. "Sarah understands what it's like to worry about money because she's been there herself. She's not trying to sell me something I don't need. She's trying to help me sleep better at night." It also included a comment from Eleanor Whitman. "While I respect Ms. Mitchell's determination, financial planning requires sophisticated expertise that comes from formal education and extensive experience with affluent clients." But the article's most powerful testimonial came from Carol Brennan. "For the first time in my life, I have a budget that actually works and an emergency fund. Sarah doesn't make me feel stupid for not knowing things. She remembers what it's like to choose between paying rent and buying groceries." The morning the article appeared, Sarah's phone didn't stop ringing. By the end of the week, she had a waiting list of potential clients and requests to present workshops at churches, community centers, and union halls throughout the region. Sarah Mitchell had found her voice, not by pretending to be someone she wasn't, but by embracing exactly who she'd always been. A financial disaster survivor who'd learned to help others navigate the same treacherous waters she'd once nearly drowned in. Her failures had become her greatest professional asset. Jessica's hands trembled as she spread her financial documents across Sarah's kitchen table, the same table where her mother had once struggled with her own bankruptcy paperwork. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The daughter seeking financial advice from the mother she'd once worried was having a breakdown. "I don't know how this happened," Jessica said, her voice tight with the kind of shame Sarah recognized all too well. "I'm a teacher. I'm supposed to be responsible. But between the student loans, the mortgage, and Emma and Tyler's expenses," she gestured helplessly at the pile of bills, "I'm drowning, Mom." Sarah studied her daughter's financial picture, with the analytical eye she'd developed over months of client consultations. Jessica's situation was painfully familiar. Middle-class income stretched beyond its limits, credit cards covering the gaps between paychecks, a growing sense of panic about the future. "Sweetie, you're not drowning," Sarah said gently. "You're treading water in deep currents. There's a difference." For the next 2 hours, Sarah walked Jessica through the same process she used with all her clients. They mapped out essential expenses versus discretionary spending, identified areas where small changes could yield significant savings, and created a realistic debt payoff plan. The key is building your emergency fund first, Sarah explained, calculating numbers on the back of an envelope with the same confidence she'd once reserved for restaurant tips. Even $50 a month. Once you have that cushion, you stop needing the credit cards for emergencies. Jessica stared at the budget Sarah had created. This actually looks manageable. How did you learn to do this? By making every mistake first, Sarah replied. I know what doesn't work because I've tried it all. Their conversation was interrupted by Bobby's unexpected arrival. Sarah's son stood in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his expensive suit. From court, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene of his sister seeking financial guidance from their mother. Bobby, Jessica said, quickly gathering her paperwork. I didn't know you were coming by. I was in the area for a deposition, Bobby said, his lawyer's voice carefully neutral. Thought I'd stop by and see how Mom's new venture is going. The tension in the room thickened like humidity before a storm. Bobby had maintained polite distance since Sarah passed her licensing exam, offering congratulations, but no real engagement with her career change. Actually, Sarah said, would you like to see the office? I know you haven't had a chance to visit yet. Bobby's hesitation was visible. I suppose I could spare a few minutes. 20 minutes later, they stood in Sarah's modest office while she showed Bobby her client files, her continuing education certificates, and the framed copy of her Series 65 results. Bobby examined everything with the thoroughness of a lawyer reviewing evidence. You really have 17 clients now? He asked, studying her client management system. 19 as of yesterday, Sarah replied. Mostly working-class folks, who never thought they could afford financial planning. Bobby was quiet for a long moment, looking out her window at the auto parts store parking lot. Mom, can I ask you something? When I was growing up, when things were really bad financially, did you ever consider that maybe your problems affected us too? Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. They'd never talked about this directly. The childhood trauma of financial instability, the way money stress had infected their family dynamics. Every day, she said quietly. Bobby, I know I wasn't the mother you deserved. I know the financial chaos made your childhood harder than it should have been. Do you? Bobby turned to face her, and Sarah saw years of buried resentment in his eyes. Do you know what it was like to have friends ask why we moved so much? Why the phone got disconnected? Why I couldn't go on school trips? The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She'd known her financial struggles affected her children, but she'd never heard Bobby articulate the specific ways it had shaped his childhood. I used to lie, Bobby continued, his voice cracking slightly. I'd make up stories about why we couldn't afford things. I got so good at it that lying became second nature. Do you know how that affects a kid? Sarah sank into her desk chair, overwhelmed by the weight of her son's pain. Bobby, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was doing the best I could, but I know that's not enough. I know my best wasn't good enough. The thing is, Bobby said, sitting down across from her, I spent so many years being angry about our financial instability that I never really appreciated what you did manage to provide. You kept us fed. You kept us housed, even if we moved a lot. You never let us go without the important things. Bobby looked around the office again, taking in the simple but professional setup. The high certificates on the wall. The evidence of his mother's transformation. When Jessica called to tell me she was coming to you for financial advice, my first instinct was to talk her out of it. I mean, you're our mother, but you're also... He paused, searching for words. You're also the woman who filed for bankruptcy twice. But watching you here, seeing what you've built, Hearing you talk about your clients? Bobby shook his head. I think I've been so focused on your financial failures that I missed something important. What's that? You understand money problems in a way I never could. I've been successful financially, but I've never had to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. I've never had to rebuild from nothing. Bobby met her eyes. Maybe that's exactly what makes you qualified to help people who are facing those choices. That evening, the three of them gathered for dinner at Sarah's apartment, the first family meal they'd shared in over a year. As they ate takeout Chinese food and talked about Jessica's budget plan, Sarah felt something shifting in their family dynamic. I have a confession, Bobby said as they cleared the dishes. I've been telling people at the firm about your career change. At first, I was embarrassed. But lately, I've been proud. You took your biggest weakness and turned it into your greatest strength. That takes courage I'm not sure I have. Jessica reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. Mom, I want to apologize too. When you first told us about becoming a financial advisor, I thought you were having another manic episode. I didn't believe you could actually do it. I wasn't sure I could either, Sarah admitted. But I had to try. I couldn't keep being the cautionary tale forever. Bobby raised his beer bottle in a mock toast. To Sarah Mitchell, financial disaster turned financial advisor. May your clients benefit from all your expensive mistakes. They laughed, but the moment carried real weight, forgiveness, acceptance, and something approaching pride. The family that had been fractured by financial stress was finally beginning to heal, not despite Sarah's past failures, but because of how she'd transformed them into wisdom. Outside, November wind rattled the windows, but inside, three people who'd learned to love each other through poverty and bankruptcy discovered they could love each other through success as well. The Granite State Financial Advisors mixer was held in the ballroom of the Manchester Marriott, where crystal chandeliers cast warm light over a sea of expensive suits and practiced smiles. Sarah stood near the appetizer table, nursing a club soda and feeling like an imposter in her department. Store blazer. She'd come to network, but every conversation seemed to begin and end with college credentials she didn't have and client assets she couldn't match. Sarah Mitchell? A gravelly voice interrupted her retreat toward the exit. You're the one who's been making waves with the bankruptcy workshops. Sarah turned to find a man in his 70s studying her with sharp blue eyes. Bill Davidson was shorter than she'd expected, with silver hair that looked like he'd forgotten to comb it, and a rumpled suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His reputation preceded him, 45 years in the business, founded one of the most respected independent advisory firms in New England before retiring 5 years ago. Mr. Davidson, I've heard a lot about you. Nothing good, I hope. His smile was wry but not unkind. I've been hearing about your unconventional approach, advertising your financial failures as qualifications. Interesting strategy. Sarah braced herself for another lecture about professionalism. I believe in honesty with clients. Do you now? Bill's eyes narrowed. Tell me something, Mitchell. What's the difference between systematic and unsystematic risk? The question came without warning, delivered like a test she hadn't studied for. But Sarah had learned these concepts not just from textbooks, but from her own painful experience. Systematic risk is market-wide, like what happened in 2008. It affects everyone regardless of their individual choices. Unsystematic risk is specific to individual companies or sectors. You can protect against it through diversification, but systematic risk is harder to avoid. Bill nodded slowly. And how would you explain that to a client who never finished high school? Sarah thought about Frank Thompson, about Carol Brennan, about all the clients who'd hired her precisely because she spoke their language. I'd tell them systematic risk is like a recession. It hurts everyone whether you're smart or not. Unsystematic risk is like betting everything on one company or one industry. If that company goes under, you're in trouble. But the rest of the economy might be fine. That's why you don't put all your eggs in one basket. Something shifted in Bill's expression. Not bad. Now tell me about your biggest financial mistake. Which one? Sarah's laugh was rueful. I've made so many it's hard to choose. The one that taught you the most. Sarah considered lying, offering up some minor misstep that wouldn't reveal the full scope of her failures. But authenticity had gotten her this far. My second husband convinced me to take out a home equity loan to invest in his restaurant, she said. $40,000 that represented everything I had. The restaurant failed within 6 months because he was skimming money to cover gambling debts I didn't know about. I lost my house, my savings, and my marriage all at once. Ouch. Bill winced. What did you learn? Never invest money you can't afford to lose. Never make financial decisions based on emotion. And never, ever give someone else control over your financial future without understanding exactly where your money is going. Bill was quiet for a moment, studying her face. You know what the problem is with most financial advisors today? They've never been broke. They don't understand what it's like to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. They can calculate standard deviations and correlation coefficients, but they can't look a client in the eye and say, I know exactly how scared you are right now. But is that a bad thing? Sarah asked. Depends on the client. For wealthy folks who want to get wealthier, maybe not. But for working people who just want security? Bill shook his head. They need someone who understands their fears because they've lived them. Jake Williams appeared at Sarah's elbow, slightly out of breath from navigating the crowded room. Mr. Davidson, I was hoping to catch you. Have you two been introduced? We're getting acquainted, Bill said dryly. Young Williams here has been singing your praises, Mitchell. Says you're the real deal. She is, Jake said earnestly. You should see her with clients. She has this way of making complex concepts accessible without being condescending. And her client retention rate is remarkable. Nobody's left her practice since she started. Bill raised an eyebrow. Nobody. Not one, Sarah confirmed. Though, to be fair, most of my clients had nowhere else to go. Other advisors either ignored them or intimidated them. That's exactly what I mean, Bill said. You found an underserved market because you understand it personally. He paused, seeming to weigh his words. Tell me, Mitchell, what's your biggest challenge right now? Sarah glanced around the room full of successful professionals with their expensive suits and confident demeanor. Honestly, I feel like I'm making it up as I go along. I know the regulatory requirements and the technical concepts, but I don't have the depth of experience that comes from working with complex estates or sophisticated investment strategies. Good, Bill said, surprising her. Self-awareness is the first sign of wisdom. The ones who think they know everything are the dangerous ones. An hour later, Sarah found herself at a quiet table in the hotel bar with Bill, sharing war stories from their respective careers. Bill talked about building his practice from nothing in the 1970s, when financial planning was more art than science. Sarah described her recent clients, working families trying to save for retirement on modest incomes, seniors who'd been burned by unscrupulous advisors, young people drowning in student debt. I'll make you a deal, Bill said as they finished their drinks. I've got more knowledge about advanced planning strategies than I know what to do with, and not enough interesting clients to keep me engaged. You've got clients who need help, and a perspective I could learn from. What do you say we help each other? Sarah stared at him. You want to mentor me? I want to work with you. There's a difference. Mentoring implies I have all the answers and you have all the questions. I think we both have something to teach each other. 2 weeks later, Bill appeared at Sarah's office with a box of files and a proposal. He would teach her advanced planning techniques, estate planning, tax strategies, insurance analysis, in exchange for her insights into serving working-class clients and her fresh perspective on the industry. First lesson, Bill said, settling into the chair across from her desk. Stop apologizing for your background. Your failures aren't something to overcome. They're your competitive advantage. Own them. As they spread client files across her desk and began discussing complex financial strategies, Sarah realized she wasn't just gaining a mentor. She was gaining a partner who understood that the best financial advice came not from textbooks, but from the hard-earned wisdom of people who'd learned to turn their worst mistakes into their greatest strengths. For the first time since starting her practice, Sarah felt like she truly belonged in the financial services industry, not despite her unconventional background, but because of it. The call came on a Tuesday morning in February, delivered through Martha Stevens at the community center with the formality of a royal summons. Margaret Maggie O'Brien requested a meeting to discuss potential financial advisory services. Sarah's hand trembled as she wrote down the appointment details, knowing exactly what this meant. At 70, Maggie O'Brien was Grayson Falls royalty, old money that stretched back 4 generations, a sprawling estate on Elm Street, and enough influence to make or break reputations with a well-placed word at the country club. She was also notoriously difficult, having dismissed 3 financial advisors in the past 5 years for various perceived failings. "She's testing you," Bill warned during their preparation session. "Maggie doesn't need financial advice. Her portfolio could run itself. She wants to see if you're legitimate or just another small-town charlatan." Sarah spent the weekend researching everything she could find about Maggie's background. Inherited wealth from her grandfather's textile mills, widowed 15 years ago, no children, substantial charitable giving. But the details that mattered most came from Frank Thompson, who'd known the O'Brien family his entire life. "Maggie's sharp as a tack, but she's been burned before," Frank had confided. "Some fancy advisor from Boston convinced her to invest in complicated derivatives a few years back, lost her a good chunk of money. She doesn't trust easy anymore." The O'Brien mansion sat behind wrought iron gates on 2 acres of perfectly manicured grounds. Sarah drove through the gates in her 10-year-old Honda, feeling like a maintenance worker who'd gotten lost on the way to the service entrance. The house itself was a Victorian masterpiece, all towers and gingerbread trim, with leaded glass windows that had probably cost more than Sarah's annual salary. Maggie answered the door herself, a tall, elegant woman with silver hair pulled back, in a perfect chignon and jewelry that managed to be both understated and obviously expensive. Her handshake was firm, her gaze appraising. "Mrs. Mitchell, please come in." The living room was a study in old money restraint, antique furniture, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and Persian rugs that looked like museum pieces. Maggie gestured toward a wingback chair that probably predated Sarah's birth. "I trust you know why I asked you here," Maggie said, settling across from Sarah with the bearing of someone accustomed to being in charge of every conversation. "I assume you're considering financial advisory services," Sarah replied, fighting the urge to adjust her blazer or check her appearance. "I'm considering whether you're a competent professional or simply this season's local curiosity." Maggie's smile was sharp as winter sunlight. "I've been hearing quite a lot about your unconventional background." There it was, the challenge Sarah had been expecting. She could try to deflect, to emphasize her credentials and professional training. Or she could do what had worked with every other client, tell the truth. "Mrs. O'Brien, I'm sure you've heard about my bankruptcies, my financial failures, the fact that I started this career at 62 with no traditional qualifications." Sarah met Maggie's gaze directly. "All of that is true. The question is whether you see those experiences as disqualifications or as exactly the perspective you need." Maggie's eyebrow arched slightly. "Explain." "You mentioned being burned by advisors before. I'm guessing they were impressive on paper, prestigious schools, impressive client lists, polished presentations. They probably talked about market inefficiencies and alpha generation and made you feel like they had access to some secret knowledge." Something flickered in Maggie's eyes. "Continue." But when things went wrong, they had explanations instead of solutions. They blamed market, conditions or regulatory changes or anything except their own misjudgment. Because people who've never failed don't know how to take responsibility for failure. Maggie was silent for a long moment, studying Sarah's face. "You're referring to Bradford Sinclair." "I don't know the name, but I know the type. Smooth? Confident. Probably drove an expensive car and took you to lunch at the country club." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. O'Brien, I've made every financial mistake it's possible to make. I've trusted the wrong people, chased unrealistic returns, borrowed money I couldn't repay, but that means I can spot those mistakes from a mile away. And what makes you think I need that perspective? I've been managing money successfully for decades." It was a fair challenge. Sarah had studied Maggie's publicly available information, but she was operating on instinct now, reading the subtle signs she'd learned to recognize in clients who'd been hurt before. "Because wealth doesn't make you immune to bad advice," Sarah said. "If anything, it makes you a bigger target. People see your assets and assume you must want complex strategies, exotic investments, anything except the boring fundamentals that actually preserve wealth." Maggie's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "What would you recommend for someone in my position?" Sarah had prepared for this question, but she realized now that Maggie wasn't asking for investment advice. She was asking for understanding. "I'd recommend finding an advisor who cares more about preserving what you have than impressing you with what they know. Someone who understands that your wealth represents security, legacy, and independence, not just numbers on a statement." "And you believe you're that person?" "I believe I'm someone who's learned that financial security isn't about maximizing returns. It's about sleeping well at night, knowing your money is working for your goals instead of someone else's commission." Maggie rose and walked to the window overlooking her gardens. "Bradford convinced me to invest in structured products that I didn't understand. When I asked questions, he made me feel foolish for not grasping their sophistication. I lost $200,000 before I finally insisted on getting out." Sarah felt a familiar anger rise in her chest, the same fury she'd experienced listening to Frank's story, watching predatory advisors exploit people's trust and financial insecurity. "I'm sorry that happened to you. $200,000 is significant even for someone with your resources." "It wasn't the money," Maggie said, turning back to face Sarah. "It was the feeling of being patronized, of having my intelligence insulted while my wealth was being mismanaged. The assumption that because I inherited money instead of earning it, I couldn't possibly understand how to preserve it." Sarah understood. Maggie's wealth had made her a target, but it had also made people assume she didn't deserve the same respect and honesty they'd show to someone who'd built their fortune from nothing. "Mrs. O'Brien, I can't promise I'll never make mistakes. But I can promise I'll never talk down to you, never sell you something I don't understand myself, and never prioritize my profits over your peace of mind." Maggie returned to her chair, her posture slightly less formal than before. "What would your approach be for someone with my portfolio size and objectives?" For the next hour, Sarah outlined a conservative strategy focused on wealth preservation and consistent income, municipal bonds for tax efficiency, dividend-paying blue-chip stocks for inflation protection, and enough liquidity to maintain Maggie's lifestyle without touching principal. Nothing exotic, nothing that required a PhD in mathematics to understand. "This is rather simple," Maggie observed. "The best strategies usually are. Complexity is often just a way to justify higher fees." When Sarah finished her presentation, Maggie sat quietly for several minutes, studying the single-page summary Sarah had prepared. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to ask you to manage a portion of my portfolio on a trial basis. $500,000 to start. If you perform competently, for 6 months we'll discuss expanding the relationship." Sarah felt her heart skip. $500,000 was more than all her other clients' assets combined. But more than the money, Maggie's trust represented something else. validation that her approach could work with clients at every level. "I'm honored by your confidence," Sarah said. "I won't take it lightly." As Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave, Maggie walked her to the door. "You should know," Maggie said. "Eleanor Whitman called me last week. She suggested I might be making a mistake, trusting someone with your background." Sarah's stomach clenched. "What did you tell her?" Maggie's smile was razor-sharp. "I told her that in my experience, the people who've never failed are the ones you have to worry about. They have no idea how to handle adversity when it comes." Standing on the steps of the O'Brien mansion, Sarah felt the weight of transformation, settling around her like a perfectly tailored coat. 6 months ago, she'd been the town's financial disaster. Now she was the advisor trusted by its wealthiest resident. The woman who'd lost everything had finally proven she could help others keep what mattered most. 1 year. Sarah stood in her office on a crisp October morning, looking at the anniversary card Linda had left on her desk. To Sarah, who proved that it's never too late to rewrite your story. Outside her window, the same maple trees that had been shedding leaves when she'd started this journey were ablaze with autumn color again, but everything else had changed. Her client roster had grown to 37 people, representing nearly $2 million in assets under management. Not impressive by Eleanor Whitman's standards, perhaps, but transformative for Sarah. More importantly, her clients came from every corner of Grayson Falls society, from Frank Thompson with his modest Social Security benefits to Maggie O'Brien with her generational wealth. The phone rang, interrupting her reflection. Jake Williams' voice carried urgency. "Sarah, you need to see the news. The market's down 300 points and falling. Something about European debt concerns and banking instability." Sarah's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety, her first major market correction as an investment advisor. Everything she'd learned, everything she'd built, would be tested by forces completely beyond her control. By noon, her phone was ringing constantly. Panicked clients watching their portfolio values plummet, demanding explanations she didn't have and solutions that didn't exist. Frank Thompson arrived at her office without an appointment, his face ashen. "Sarah, I'm seeing the news about the markets. Are we going to lose everything again?" Sarah pulled up Frank's portfolio on her computer. Down 8% for the day, but still, well above where they'd started. His conservative allocation was performing exactly as designed, declining less than the broad market while preserving the capital he couldn't afford to lose. "Frank, remember what we talked about when we set up your portfolio? We chose investments that could weather storms like this. You're down today, but you're still ahead for the year. But what if it keeps falling? What if this is like 2008 all over again?" Sarah looked at Frank's worried face and realized this was her moment of truth. Not the Series 65 exam, not winning over Maggie O'Brien, but this, helping a client stay calm during market chaos. "Frank, in 2008 you lost everything because you were concentrated in high-risk investments you didn't understand. Today, you own boring government bonds and dividend-paying utilities. The companies that provide electricity and water don't disappear because the stock market has a bad day." Frank's breathing slowed as Sarah's calm confidence steadied him. "So we don't need to do anything. We need to do exactly what we plan to do. Stay the course, ignore the noise, and remember that market volatility is the price we pay for long-term returns." Similar conversations played out throughout the day. Carol Brennan worried about her small emergency fund investment. Mike Santos wondered if he should stop contributing to his daughter's college savings. Each client needed reassurance that their financial plans could survive market turbulence. But Sarah's biggest test came that evening, when Maggie O'Brien called. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm watching my portfolio value fluctuate by more in a single day than most people make in a year. I find myself questioning whether we're positioned appropriately for this level of volatility." Sarah could hear the controlled tension in Maggie's voice. This was exactly the moment when wealthy clients typically panicked and made emotional decisions that destroyed their long-term financial security. "Mrs. O'Brien, your portfolio is down about 6% today. That's painful to watch, but it's also exactly what we expected might happen occasionally. We structured your investments to survive days like this." Bradford Sinclair used to tell me the same thing right before he sold me something new to protect against downside risk. Sarah understood. Maggie was testing whether Sarah would use market volatility as an excuse to churn the portfolio and generate fees. "Mrs. O'Brien, I'm not going to sell you anything today. Market corrections are like New England winters, unpleasant but predictable. The mistake is changing your entire wardrobe every time the temperature drops." Maggie's laugh was surprised but genuine. "That's perhaps the most sensible thing any financial advisor has ever told me." By the end of the week, the markets had stabilized and begun recovering. More importantly, every one of Sarah's clients had stayed the course. Not a single person had panicked and sold at the bottom. The real validation came the following month, when Bobby drove up from Boston for the Grayson Falls Chamber of Commerce annual dinner. Sarah had been invited to speak about financial resilience, a topic that would have been laughable 18 months earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, looking out at a room filled with business owners, community leaders, and neighbors who'd watched her transformation. "A year ago, many of you knew me as the woman who'd filed for bankruptcy twice. Tonight, I want to talk about why that experience might be exactly what our community needs." She spoke about the financial crisis still affecting working families, about the predatory practices that targeted vulnerable people, about the importance of financial advisors who understood struggle as well as success. We live in a time when people are afraid to trust financial professionals because they've been burned before. They need advisors who've been where they are, who understand that financial security isn't about getting rich, it's about sleeping well at night. When she finished, the applause was sustained and genuine. People who'd once viewed her with pity or condescension now saw her as someone who'd transformed personal failure into community service. But the evening's most meaningful moment came when Bobby approached the podium during the open discussion period. "I'd like to say something about tonight's speaker," he said, his lawyer's voice carrying clearly through the room. "Sarah Mitchell is my mother, and for most of my life, I was embarrassed by her financial struggles. I thought they reflected poor judgment, lack of discipline, fundamental character flaws." Sarah's breath caught as Bobby continued. "I was wrong. My mother's financial failures didn't happen because she was irresponsible. They happened because she prioritized her children's security over her own, because she trusted people who betrayed that trust, because she made decisions from a place of love rather than calculation." Bobby's voice grew stronger. "Today, she's helping families throughout this community build financial security using wisdom that can only come from experiencing financial insecurity. She's turned her greatest weakness into her greatest strength, and I couldn't be more proud to be her son." The applause that followed felt like absolution, not just from the community, but from the family relationships that had been strained by years of financial stress. After the dinner, as Sarah packed up her presentation materials, Eleanor Whitman approached with an expression that might have been respect. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. When you started this practice, I thought you were delusional. I may have been overly protective of what I saw as my professional territory." Sarah studied Eleanor's face, looking for signs of manipulation or condescension. Instead, she saw something that looked like genuine humility. "Eleanor, we serve different markets. There's room for both approaches." "Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss. I've been getting inquiries from clients who are interested in the kind of practical, down-to-earth planning you offer. People who are intimidated by my office, my credentials, my client base. Would you be interested in a referral partnership?" 6 months later, Sarah stood before a regional conference of financial advisors, delivering a keynote address titled "Second Chances, How Personal Financial Failure Can Create Professional Success. The audience of 200 included some of the most successful advisors in New England. The financial services industry has a problem, Sarah began. We've become so focused on credentials and performance metrics that we've forgotten our primary job, helping people feel secure about their financial future. She told her story, the bankruptcies, the failed marriages, the decades of financial instability that had seemed like personal failings until she learned to see them as professional qualifications. I'm not advocating for financial irresponsibility, she said. I'm advocating for financial empathy, for advisors who remember that behind every portfolio is a person with hopes, fears, and dreams that can't be captured in a risk tolerance questionnaire. The speech was recorded and shared widely, leading to consulting opportunities and speaking engagements throughout the region. But Sarah's favorite response came in a handwritten letter from a young woman in Vermont who'd watched the presentation online. Mrs. Mitchell, the letter read, I'm 28 years old and drowning in student debt. I've always assumed financial advisors were only for rich people who had their lives together. After watching your speech, I'm wondering if maybe someone who's been in debt could actually help me get out of it. Would you be willing to mentor me in starting a practice focused on helping people like us? Sarah smiled as she drafted her response. The circle was completing itself. The woman who'd been written off as a financial disaster was now inspiring others to turn their struggles into strengths. Outside her office window, spring was returning to New Hampshire. The maple trees that had witnessed her transformation were budding with new growth, and somewhere in town, people who'd never thought they could afford financial planning were learning to build secure futures with help from someone who understood their fears because she'd lived them. Sarah Mitchell had conquered her proving ground. More importantly, she'd learned that the ground itself had never been the enemy. It had been the foundation for everything she was meant to become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.